August 1944. The Allied breakthrough at Normandy has torn open the German front across France. General George S. Patton's Third Army is not just advancing, it's sprinting. Units cover 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day, moving with a momentum that surprised generals and terrified planners. But with that speed came a peril no map or staff officer had fully accounted for. The armies were outrunning their lifeline. They were literally running out of the stuff that keeps armies alive: fuel, food, ammunition, medicine. The logistics tail could not stretch to match the appetite of an army in full throttle. Every Sherman tank burns roughly 5 gallons of gasoline per mile. Every infantry division consumes something like 650 tons of supplies every 24 hours. Shells, canned rations, bandages, replacement parts. The port of Cherbourg, still being patched and dredged after German demolition, could only handle a sliver of what the front demanded. Antwerp, the deepwater prize that could solve a great deal of the problem, would not be usable for months. That meant everything. Every bullet and every can of beans had to be trucked ashore from the Normandy beaches and hauled inland over roads that the retreating Wehrmacht had wrecked deliberately. At Supreme Headquarters, the numbers on the table read like a countdown. Trucks that had been the unglamorous backbone of the Allied advance now looked fragile and exposed. In just 1 week, forward units reported they had as little as 3 days of ammunition on hand. Entire tank battalions sat idle, not because of enemy action, but because fuel tanks sat empty. The arithmetic of shortages collided with the psychology of momentum. If Patton stopped, the Germans would have time to reform and entrench. If Patton kept moving with hollowed supply lines, his army could collapse from within. On August 21st, during a tense briefing, Colonel Frank Ross, Chief of Transportation, delivered a blow. "We are losing 23% of supplies before they reach the front." The causes were banal and brutal: truck accidents on shell-pocked roads, Luftwaffe strafing runs that turned convoys into columns of wreckage, mechanical failures that left valuable cargo abandoned by the roadside. Eisenhower traced the red line on the map toward the German border and heard the word everyone dreaded: weeks, maybe months, to redesign a system that was failing in days. He looked around the room and demanded answers in days, not months. The meeting adjourned without them. 90 miles from Shaw F, Technical Sergeant Raymond Kowalski Ray, to the men in his company, sat in the cab of his GMC Jimmy and stared at another shattered convoy. 8 trucks lay overturned and burned, supplies scattered like confetti along the ditch. Luftwaffe fighters had caught them bunched together on a narrow road, and the result had been carnage. Kowalski was 34, a long-haul Pittsburgh trucker before the draft turned his driving life into war. No degree, no staff, college pedigree, just a man who knew trucks down to their springs and radiators. He had watched, in the past weeks, good drivers and good cargo turn into roadside graves, not because of tactical failures, but because of systemic mistakes. He remembered a saying from his dispatcher back home: "Convoys are for show. Profits are in the spacing." It was a truism for getting freight through blizzards and mountain passes: keep the distance, don't make a tempting target. The Red Ball Express doctrine, the emergency system created to rush supplies across liberated France, prescribed the opposite: mass formations of 20 or more trucks, 60 yards apart, 80 drivers moving at 25 miles per hour maximum. Safety in numbers, the doctrine argued. But the reality on the ground was a glaring paradox. Those very formations made a visible, trackable target that a determined enemy could sight from miles away and strike with devastating efficiency. Kowalski had ridden in 6 convoys in 2 weeks. Everyone had taken hits. But what troubled him wasn't just the enemy air attacks, it was the mechanics of the attack. When a lead vehicle spotted aircraft, the entire column stopped. Trucks jammed, engines idled, men were trapped behind other men. The spacing that was meant to provide security instead created a kill zone. Yet even more telling was a small pattern Kowalski noticed in the margins. Trucks that slipped away from the mass, driven by impatient or pragmatic drivers who left as soon as their cargo was ready, were arriving at forward dumps much more reliably than the big, ceremonious convoys. On August 23rd, delayed 6 hours at a depot, Kowalski watched a handful of drivers load and go. No ceremony, no assembly. They threaded roads alone or in pairs, hours apart. Each solo truck, by virtue of being single and unpredictable, was an unattractive target to a Luftwaffe pilot burning fuel to chase a sliver of metal. The math struck him. A convoy of 20 trucks is one high-value target. 20 staggered trucks are 20 low-payoff hunts. The Germans, stretched thin in planes, pilots, and fuel, would find the dispersed system unaffordable. He began to write the numbers in a battered notebook. Convoy losses, he recorded, were averaging 23% across incidents. The independent runs he tracked showed losses near 3%. He took the notebook to Captain Dennis Hayes and said, "Sir, I think I know how to cut our supply losses by 90%. Hayes listened, then forwarded the idea up the chain. The military rule following by design recoiled. Doctrine existed for reasons: mutual support, communications, security against ambush. The formal reply was a polite but emphatic denied. Enlisted drivers were not meant to rewrite operational procedure. Kowalski laughed, bitter and small, but he did not surrender. He tried Lieutenant Colonel Martin Burgess next. Burgess heard him out, voiced the predictable concerns, breakdowns, isolated drivers in hostile territory, bypassed German units still roaming the back roads. "This isn't a peacetime trucking company," Burgess warned. Kowalski's answer was simple and brutal. "We're losing a quarter of our supplies under that peacetime logic." It was not merely a technical argument, it was a moral one. Lose the supplies, and the front loses the war. When Kowalski presented his data to the drivers, they jeered. It sounded like a death wish to many: go alone and be hunted. Colonel Ross annotated the printed proposal with a flat, bureaucratic hand. Denied. Unauthorized deviation will face court-martial. The official army had spoken. Kowalski's tick of a notebook seemed to mean nothing. There is, however, a difference between doctrine and crisis. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, a man who read everything and worried at night, had also been reading the same casualty reports. He did not sleep well in late August. Patton had been ordered to halt, not by bullets, but by empty tanks. Smith walked into Ross's office and asked the question the staff had been avoiding. Why were we accepting expected parameters when the expected parameters were immobilizing armies? The word expected slid from Ross's mouth into a silence that smelled of failure. 2 hours later, Kowalski, still smelling of diesel and dust, stood before 3 colonels and a lieutenant general. He explained his method plainly: load and go, stagger departures, vary speeds to conditions, stop massed waiting. The enemy could not target what could not be predicted. The room that had closed ranks against an enlisted man opened, however slightly, to the force of evidence when Smith asked only for numbers and a test. Kowalski would get his shot. A week, 20 trucks, his method. If losses fell under 10%, they would scale it. If not, he would take the blame. September 1st, 1944, at the Allenson Supply Depot, the experiment began. The first truck rolled at 0600. The second followed at 0618. The third at 0633. Instead of a noon departure of a mass column, trucks trickled out over 5 hours. Drivers were told to travel at safe speeds, not to the convoy's mandated crawl. The result was immediate and catalytic. Trucks began to arrive at forward dumps faster than any previous formation. The Luftwaffe, faced with dispersed pickups, found the economics of attack shifting against them. What had been a profitable, efficient interdiction became an increasingly pointless hunt. By day 3, the statistics that had seemed impossible were becoming undeniable. By the evening of September 2nd, the numbers were undeniable. 20 trucks dispatched under Kowalski's new rolling departure system had reached Patton's forward depots. 0 losses. Not a single vehicle had been hit, ambushed, or broken down beyond recovery. The only minor incident, a flat tire, was fixed on the spot by the driver himself. By comparison, the convoy sent under the old doctrine that same day had lost nearly 1 in 4 trucks to air attacks, breakdowns, or confusion on the roads. It wasn't luck. It was economics, the kind of logic that the German Luftwaffe could not fight against. Every independent truck was a low-value, unpredictable target. Hunting one cost more fuel than it was worth. A convoy, on the other hand, was a gift. A predictable, high-value concentration of targets in a neat line. The Luftwaffe had made an art of hunting them, but when the convoys disappeared and scattered into invisible threads of traffic stretching across hours and miles, that art turned meaningless. The hunters had lost their prey. Over the following week, Kowalski's experiment expanded. 20 more trucks, then 30, then 40, each sent out independently, each reporting faster arrival times and lower losses. Transportation Corps officers who had ridiculed him days earlier now stood over charts, stunned at the data. By the 5th day, the results were consistent. A 90% drop in losses and an average 30% improvement in delivery speed. On September 7th, General Bedell Smith signed the order that changed the entire Red Ball Express. Effective immediately, all operations will adopt staggered dispatch protocols as developed by Technical Sergeant Raymond Kowalski. Overnight, the largest motor transport operation in history changed its rhythm. The vast convoys that had once clogged French roads gave way to a near constant trickle of trucks, 6,000 of them moving day and night, every 3 to 5 minutes, without pause, without formation, without predictability. The results were revolutionary. In just 8 weeks from September through November 1944, the Red Ball Express moved over 412,000 tons of supplies to the front. That's enough fuel, food, and ammunition to sustain 6 Allied armies. Delivery efficiency jumped by 1/3. Supply losses dropped below 3%. German air reports from October told the story better than any Allied communique. One Luftwaffe commander wrote in frustration, "Allied trucks now move without pattern. Interdiction is uneconomical. We waste fuel hunting ghosts." The Germans had finally met an enemy that fought not with firepower, but with mathematics. Historians would later call it one of the most significant logistical innovations of the Second World War, a transformation that turned chaos into rhythm. Yet, at the time, the name Kowalski barely appeared in dispatches. For officers, it was a procedural update. For the men driving the trucks, it was a miracle. For Patton's army, it was the difference between standing still and reaching the German border. The true impact of Kowalski's system wasn't just military, it was philosophical. It challenged hierarchy itself. An enlisted truck driver, armed with nothing more than a pencil, a notebook, and real-world experience, had overturned a doctrine written by West Point and ratified by WWII. In an institution built on obedience, he had proven that logic and observation could outrank rank itself. But war, as always, moved on quickly. The Red Ball Express kept rolling. The front lines kept advancing. By December, the system that had begun as one man's crazy idea had become official Allied policy. And while the officers took notes, the drivers understood what it truly meant. They were no longer part of a slow, lumbering convoy waiting for orders. They were part of a living bloodstream, a network of constant motion feeding an army on the edge of victory. By late autumn, Eisenhower received a report summarizing the transformation. His handwritten note in the margin said it all.
Day and night,
this sergeant's method won us time, and time wins wars. For every gallon of fuel that reached Patton's tanks, every ration that fed a soldier, and every shell that found its way to the front lines, there was a trace of Kowalski's invisible signature, the logic of spacing, the rhythm of independence, the courage to disobey doctrine in the name of survival. After the war, the Army would codify it. In 1947, staggered dispatch logistics became official doctrine. What began as an act of defiance became a rule. At Fort Lee, Virginia, home of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, every logistics officer learned about the Pittsburgh truck driver who rewrote convoy theory. From Korea to Vietnam, from Desert Storm to Afghanistan, the lesson repeated itself: disperse, decentralize, and deny predictability. Even in the civilian world, the echoes of that wartime experiment lived on. The global logistics systems of the 21st century, the just-in-time models of Amazon, UPS, and FedEx follow the same principle: continuous, staggered dispatch, maximum efficiency through distributed movement. Avoid bottlenecks, reduce vulnerability. In essence, the same math that kept Patton's tanks fueled now keeps your packages moving. Kowalski never wrote a book, never gave interviews, never called himself an innovator. When he came home to Pittsburgh in 1946, he simply went back to driving trucks. He had a Bronze Star, a drawer full of memories, and no idea that the world he returned to was already running on a system that bore his fingerprints. In the years that followed, the war's memory faded into history, but its lessons and the quiet revolutions born from necessity continued to ripple across generations. The Red Ball Express was disbanded in November 1944, just before winter closed the French countryside under mud and frost. Yet its short existence had carried more strategic weight than some entire campaigns. It proved that logistics, the unglamorous backbone of war, could decide the fate of nations as surely as the armies at the front. And it all began with a single truck driver's stubborn refusal to accept standard procedure. When General Eisenhower reviewed the post-war logistics analysis in 1946, he underlined a statistic in pencil: reduction of supply loss from 23% to under 3%. Beside it, he scrawled a note to Bedell Smith. This proves that innovation at the lowest level is essential to command at the highest. For a supreme commander who had seen grand strategy bend under the weight of broken supply lines, it was a rare acknowledgement that victory had been carried not just by generals, but by ordinary men who saw what others missed. The U.S. Army formalized Kowalski's method in 1947, embedding it into the Transportation Corps doctrine as staggered dispatch logistics. It became a cornerstone of post-war military education. Cadets at Fort Lee learned the same principle that Kowalski had discovered by instinct, that in warfare, predictability kills. From the Korean hills to the deserts of Iraq, from the Berlin airlift to Vietnam's jungle roads, the method evolved with technology, but the heartbeat remained the same. Keep supplies moving, stay unpredictable, and make the enemy's effort to disrupt you economically impossible. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, U.S. supply convoys stretched hundreds of miles across the desert, coordinated by satellite and GPS. Yet, at their core, they followed Kowalski's principle. Each vehicle had its own window of movement, speed variations, and departure timing. The goal was no longer to move in unison, but in controlled chaos. Modern algorithms would later refine the same idea, turning it into mathematics of flow distribution. But the seed of that concept was born on a muddy French road under the shadow of Luftwaffe fighters. Civilian logistics followed suit. The same philosophy that had kept Allied soldiers alive during World War II quietly became the logic that powers global commerce. Companies like UPS and FedEx discovered that constant dispatch, rather than bulk shipments, increased efficiency, reduced risk, and allowed for real-time adaptability. Factories stopped storing weeks of inventory and adopted just-in-time systems, mirroring the flexibility that had once kept Patton's tanks running. Amazon's continuous delivery network, where vans depart every few minutes from fulfillment centers instead of in scheduled batches, is essentially a 21st century echo of the Red Ball Express. Few in the corporate boardrooms of logistics giants know the name Raymond Kowalski. Yet every time a delivery truck leaves a warehouse alone, unsynchronized, but part of an invisible rhythm of efficiency, it carries his legacy. In 2003, the U.S. Army Transportation Museum at Fort Lee opened an exhibit honoring the Red Ball Express. Among the photos of dusty convoys and the massive GMC trucks that carved a path through war-torn Europe, there was a small glass case. Inside it sat a tattered leather notebook filled with grease-stained pages of handwritten numbers, fuel consumption rates, convoy losses, and survival ratios. A small placard beside it read, "Sometimes the best innovations come not from the commanders who write the rules, but from the people who live with their consequences." Visitors might miss it at first. It's an unassuming display. But for those who linger, the story unfolds like a quiet revelation. That notebook and the man who wrote in it reshaped how the modern world moves. Raymond Kowalski died in 1983 at age 73 in the same Pittsburgh neighborhood where he had grown up. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his Bronze Star, but said nothing about the revolution he sparked. It called him simply a retired truck driver, veteran, and family man. But for military historians and logistics scholars, his name represents something greater, a rare instance when practical knowledge and courage to question authority rewired an entire system of thought. Today, in every military academy where logistics is taught, in every engineering paper about distributed supply chain theory, there's a footnote, sometimes just a line, sometimes a whole paragraph about technical Sergeant Raymond "Ray" Kowalski, the man who proved that sometimes the craziest idea is simply the truth that no one wants to see. His insight that spacing creates resilience remains a universal law of movement, whether in warfare, commerce, or data. It's the same reason internet traffic is routed dynamically, why aircraft take off in staggered schedules, why even modern drone swarms operate asynchronously to confuse interception. What began as a desperate act of adaptation in 1944 became a guiding principle for systems that define the modern world. The Red Ball Express has long since vanished, its roads paved over and its depots forgotten. but its invisible rhythm still beats in supply chains, in servers, in convoys across distant battlefields. All because one truck driver from Pittsburgh refused to wait for permission.